Hello everybody. Today we're talking about grain-derived flavors. So the types of grain that we would typically see used in the brewing process, for the most part, it's just going to be barley. Barley, wheat, oats, rye, corn, and rice. The American light lagers, of course, have really increased the percentage of corn and rice used in beer, just because the typical American adjunct lager is either corn or rice adjuncted. Whether that be liquid corn or liquid rice in the various corn syrups or rice syrup. They are one of the more efficient ways to use it, even though some claim that they don't use corn syrup. They likely do. Doesn't make any sense not to, and that's the cheaper version of it. So, in order to use it for the brewing process of the grain, the barley has to be malted. And basically that is beginning the growing process, but then stopping it at exactly the moment that we want it to. So of course the grain is steeped, just like if you put it in the ground, you have to water it in order for it to grow. So the grain steeped in water, allowed to germinate. At the correct time, that is stopped by a process called kilning, where heat is used to basically kill the grain. The grain is modified by an enzymatic process that goes on during that growing process, and that's really what makes it suitable for brewing. So enzymes that occur naturally in the grain, they begin to break down the storage starch that the sugar is stored in the grain, and it makes it into it primes the enzymes and it primes those starches for the mashing process, where they are further broken down into fermentable sugars. But that whole process is really what makes a grain usable for us as brewers in the brewing process. And base malts are minimally processed, so they are lightly kilned and highly modified. And that lets them have that diastatic power to help convert starches into fermentable sugars, not just for themselves, but also for other grains that may not have that enzymatic power. Then we've got caramel or crystal malts, depending on what you call it. They are pretty much the same thing. Those are described as being mashed in the husk. So instead of being crushed and then thrown in the mash tun and mashed in that, they're actually mashed in the husk through a process with water and heat, of course, and then roasted and allowed all that stuff to stay in the grain itself. Then you've got roasted malts, which are much darker, and then caramel or crystal malts, and then some special processed malts we'll get into. So the two main reactions that really develop flavors beyond what it just occurs naturally within the grain itself are caramelization and Maillard reactions. So they kind of do similar, or the end products are similar, but very different processes. Caramelization is a non-enzymatic heat-based process that breaks down sugars, causes isomerization and polymerization. So when you think of a caramel, a little piece of candy, that starts as sucrose, just table sugar, and add a little bit of water and just boil it down, and that gets you from that white powder to that thick, brown, dark, viscous substance. You think about that's exactly what we're going for, those flavors, those rich toffee caramel flavors. A Maillard reaction is actually a non-enzymatic chemical reaction involving a reducing sugar, so a sugar that has an alcohol group sticking out on one point and an amino acid. So the amino acid is the building blocks of proteins. So it's really a sugar-protein combination reaction. This can occur without heat, but like most chemical reactions, is accelerated by adding heat to the process. I don't know how long it would take to do so without the heat of the brewing process, but probably wouldn't make any sense to try to do it without it. But those are the two main things that are developed during the kilning process, whether it be really light or non-existent at all in the lighter base malts, or extensively in some of the darker caramel malts and the roasted malts. And also something that happens during our process of boiling. We do get the same thing, caramelization Mayard reactions, because we do have sugars and reacting with heat and sugars reacting with protein that occur naturally in the brewing process. And these are our two main flavor contributions, besides what occur naturally, just the flavor of the sugar itself in the grain, flavors that are developed in the brewing process and in the malting process. So malted barley, two main types, a 6-row and 2-row. And the 6-row, when you see a picture of it, the head itself just looks crowded. And that's kind of what the issue is with 6-row. You get inconsistent kernel size because it's just crowded. There's just not a whole lot of space there for that many kernels. There's also a high protein content, which is not the best for brewing, unless you're going to cut that with an adjunct. So breweries like Budweiser, they use 6-row malt, and they use a lot of corn or rice to cut that barley or that protein content down. And 2-row, it's the main malting barley that is available. It's nice, neat rows on each side of the head, get nice uniform kernel size, and that's basically all that's used in most of your malts. So malted barley, we also have different strains of malted barley that's grown. Some of the older ones, the heritage varieties that have been around, maybe without the research developed to prevent disease and drought tolerance. So we've got Chevalier, Golden Promise, and Maris Otter. Personally, I've never used Golden Promise, but I hear very good things about it. Maris Otter itself I have used, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then you've got your modern 2-row malts. As you can see, many different name brands of malts or strains or breeds of malts, or barley. And a lot of malting companies will do a blend of different strains to make up their proprietary blends. And at this point in time, it may also be just they got to do a blend based on what's available. So Maris Otter is a popular heritage variety for making English styles, and it is billed as a very malty base malt. I don't believe that. In my experience, we've made some smash ales using only Maris Otter, and it's kind of bland, one note, a little malty, but not like people describe it as. But when used in combination with other malts, in my opinion, it becomes what I've described as a malt multiplier. So when you've got, let's say, use it with a little Munich Malt or maybe a little biscuit malt, the combination of the two are greater than if you had done them separately. So there's a synergistic effect, in my opinion. That's why I call it a malt multiplier. It is best, in my opinion, when paired with other malting barleys as well. And it's just fantastic when used appropriately. By itself, like I said, it's kind of one note, kind of bland. And I might get a lot of flack for that, but hey, that's my experience. We've made a smash with it, and that was only malt, and just it was all right. So base malt flavors. Pilgrim Ball is the lowest temperature kilned, lightest colored base malt. So it's got a very low kilning temperature, and in the grand scheme of the idea of brewing, it's rather new. It was invented by Pilsner Urquell Brewery. The kilning process was, and that's how they invented the style of Pilsner beer, because they were able to kiln their malt at such a low temperature. So it has a flavor and aroma of just fresh wort, just bright, delicious wort. Problem is the lower kilning temperature doesn't drive off the DMS precursors, SMM and DMSO, so it can be present. So if you don't have a vigorous boil, if you don't boil long enough, you can have some corn, creamed corn flavors, vegetable flavors in your beer. Not ideal, but just make sure you have a vigorous boil, and make sure you boil 90 minutes if you can. Correct that issue. We've got pale ale malt. You got a nice malty flavor, some hints of biscuit or toast. Very good base malts. That's what we use here at Henderson Brewing Company. A little bit higher killing temperatures, so it drives off most of your precursors for DMS. You don't really have an issue with any kind of DMS. We have done reduced boils and haven't had any kind of issue with DMS at all. Then you've got pale malt. Pale malt kind of what makes up a lot of two-row brewers malts. A little bit of a deeper malt flavor than Pilsner malt, a little bit less than pale ale malt. Just very slight distinctions between the three there. Then we jump over to some continental malts. So Vienna malt, traditionally a German malt. Very rich malt, slightly nutty, slightly toasty, but not overly sweet, kind of showcased in Oktoberfest beers. It really does, not only Oktoberfest beers, but a Vienna lager as well. Just a really nice, rich flavor by itself. And then you've got Munich Malt, also a German malt, hence the name Munich. It is, when people think of what malt tastes like, Munich Malt is kind of the definition. It is that rich grain malt flavor. There are lighter versions and darker versions, and the flavors kind of go with that range as well. The lighter versions have lighter flavors, not as rich. Darker versions have a little bit more boldness to them. And then we've got some melanoidin malts, also known as honey malts. It produces a distinct honey flavor or aroma. Definitely, if you're going to make a honey pale ale or any kind of thing that people would expect to taste honey in, I would highly recommend using this, because honey itself is fully fermentable. You don't really get much of that sweetness or flavor from the honey. If you pair that with a honey malt, along with using honey, you get that nice, sweet, rich floral aroma that you would expect from a honey malt or honey beer or honey blonde, whatever you're looking for. We've got the caramel and crystal malts, and here's kind of where you get a lot of your interesting flavors. So we've got a special glassy malt. That's also known as Carapils, and really it's just kind of a dextrin malt. Adds body, doesn't add a whole lot of flavor, doesn't add a whole lot of color either. It's just really there for body and foam. You got caramel and crystal malt. Basically the same thing, caramel, crystal. It's kind of an interchangeable name. And the flavors range based on the degree of heating. So it would range from like the 10 degrees level bond all the way up to 120. And once you get much higher than that, you get into roasted flavors rather than caramel and crystal malts. But each difference in level bond, some of them go like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, up to 120. There really is a different flavor for each one of those, and it's just from the difference in caramelization and Maillard reactions as well. And the lighter ones are going to be toasty, bready, not quite burnt bread, but bread crust. All the way up to the mid, you've got some caramel, toffee, 50, 60, 70 range, caramel, toffee, some rich malt flavors. Farther into closer to the hundreds, you're getting into raisins, a deep toffee, little hints of chocolate, just real thick, darker flavors of the malt. Go much higher, you're getting into chocolate, more acrid, you get more of the smoky and burnt flavors. And that's where you're getting into chocolate malt, but we'll get there. So you've got roasted malts. So these are high temperature, low moisture roasting. So you've got biscuit malt, you got a real nutty, toasted, or just like a biscuit. Very interesting flavors. Amber malt, toffee, baked bread, nuts. So it also, the process of making amber malt produces pyrazines, pyrrolenes, that can impart a slight bitterness. So when you get into some roasted malts, your perceived bitterness can be affected. So you want to take that into account when designing a recipe. So you've got let's say you're making a stout and you're using a bunch of roasted malts. Your IBU calculation, let's say it's maybe 30. That calculation might be accurate, but your perceived bitterness is going to be higher because of that roasted flavors that you're getting from the grain. It might taste 45 to 50. There's that much of a difference. Brown malt, similar flavors to amber malt, but just more complex, more developed, a little darker as well. Just more complete, complex flavor. To taste the difference between the two, you'll understand the difference. It's just a little more complex, a little darker, a little nuttier, a little deeper. When we get into chocolate malt, so you really start to develop that rich, unsweetened chocolate, cocoa, dark chocolate flavor, and also coffee flavor with a slight astringency from the roasting process. So a little bit of dryness to the flavors itself. But chocolate malt really is kind of the sweet area for that chocolate and coffee flavor. Much higher than that, and you're getting away from anything that might be perceived as chocolate or sweet almost. When you get into black malt, it's just bitter, dry, burnt, smoky flavors, but those work really well in stouts. A combination with a thicker body, with some Irish stouts a little drier body, they can just be fantastic. And then you've got roasted barley, and that is not malted, so you've got a slightly different intensity of flavor. It's very similar to black malt, but it's just not as intense. You still got that smoky, acrid, burnt astringency flavor, but it's just not as pronounced as black malt. Kind of going back to the black malt and roasted barley, it's another thing. I can't remember if I covered it, but debittered black malt. So those are malts that have been roasted to a degree of black malt, but they don't have a husk. So you've got midnight wheat, and you also have debittered black malt, which is basically barley without the husk. So when you don't have that husk, you don't get that astringency, that real bitter flavor. So you can get a nice color contribution without that intensity of flavor. So midnight wheat and debittered black can be used for intense color adjustments without adding that much flavor. It's quite interesting. It can really throw you off when you see this dark beer thrown at you and it doesn't taste anywhere near like it should. We have special malts. So we've got acidulated malt. This is how brewers in Germany adjust pH of their mash while maintaining compliance to the Reinheitsgebot, because they can't add acid. It's just not allowed. So they use acidulated malt, and basically it's malt that's been allowed to sour just from the natural lactobacillus that occurs on the husks of barley in general. Used correctly, the flavors really shouldn't be apparent, because really you're just using it to adjust pH in your mash. So you really don't want that flavor unless you're really using a whole bunch of it. But it can be described as a bright, crisp acidity if it does start to adjust or impact the flavor of your beer. Smoked malt, exactly as billed there. It's got a malt and it's got a smoky flavor. But that smoky flavor that's imparted on the grain really depends on the fuel that's used to create that smoke. So you got applewood, cherrywood, or peat. You know, we'll cover peated malt as well. But the flavors imparted by the smoke are really dependent on the fuel that's used. So you can get different flavors of smoke can give different flavors of smoked malt. And a little goes a long way. We'll put it that way. A little goes a long way. It does not take much smoked malt to impart a smoke flavor to your beer. And you get too much smoke flavor into your beer, and it is going to be a slow seller. It is going to be just polarizing. You're going to have few people that love it, and most people aren't going to like it at all. Probably pair well with some barbecue, though. And we've got some other malts. We've got wheat malt. Of course, you've got flavors of distinct wheat or bread flavors. The bread flavor kind of coincides with the yeast that's often left in suspension with wheat beers, like Bavarian wheat beers. American wheats, they don't. You just use American yeast and it falls out. So you just get a hint of that wheat bread flavor. Interesting thing with wheat malt is you can have some variation from season to season because wheat that's used in the malting process is not specifically grown for beer or the malting process at all. They just kind of get whatever's available. And I have experienced here at Henderson Brewing Company a significant variation from season to season. Sometimes our Hefeweizen clocks in using the exact same recipe in the low to mid 4s, and some seasons it clocks in the upper 5s to almost 6%. And that is just a variation of the sugar content of the wheat, because we don't have that kind of variation with any of our other barley beers. So it's purely just from seasonal variation from the wheat itself, and that's just based on the fact that it's not really grown for brewing. So you don't have the same quality standards that is involved with growing barley. Rye malt, you got that very distinct rye spiciness. Not a fan of it myself. I think it's off-putting, but a lot of people like it. Had a rye IPA, and we had a homebrewing competition here that actually paired well with the hops, and it almost won it. It got second place in that competition, but I wouldn't drink more than one. It's an off-putting flavor for me. I think it can be tiring on a palate as well. And then oat malt, you've got a rich granola-like flavor. The oats that we use here are not malted. They're just rolled oats like you would eat for breakfast. All right, thank you.